Good morning. I was just clarifying with Father Nicholas. We do have one more lecture next Sunday, and it will be here. I am told that Mouse is coming down after Saturday night, and that we will have our liturgies in here Sunday morning and our formation. So it will be in this room next Sunday for the final class. I only have two more sets of syllabi. If anybody does not have one, we can make more, and if anyone doesn't get one and needs it, you can send me an email and I will be happy to send it back to you, but I do have two left. I also did a list of suggested readings. I assumed that most of you didn't care to have these, and so I've only made 10 copies. But again, if you want one and don't get it this morning, send me an email and I'll be happy to send it off to you. It's an annotated reading list. I've given you about one sentence on each one. As I mentioned in the very first class, when we talk about history, particularly the history of ideas, the philosophy of the writer or the speaker necessarily colors the description of the history. And you will find, if you look through several of the books that I have listed, that you will get 2 or 3 quite different interpretations as to how all of this happened. And I've tried to give you a one-line description of where I think it comes from. For example, 1 or 2 of the books are used in Bible colleges, which typically are evangelical fundamentalist schools, and tend to be quite conservative in their view of history. And 2 of the books on here are from those introductory courses. Some of the other courses, some of the other books are much more controversial. For example, John Dominic Crossan's book on Many Christianities, which has been debated in the 20 years since he wrote it over and over again at various conventions. And so I did think it was necessary to give you at least one sentence on each of them to give you a cue as to what you might be in for if you decide to take that one. Last week I ended very quickly, I'm afraid, with a short description of what we now call Gnosticism, which was one of 3 or 4 major strains of Christianity which persisted for hundreds of years after the resurrection. It probably started in Alexandria, but it spread throughout the Roman Empire. And certainly by the time of Constantine, it was the second largest form of Christianity being practiced in the Roman Empire. The key beliefs of the Gnostics, most of which were repudiated at the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. That's an important fact. Most of which were repudiated by the Council of Nicaea, which of course is the precedent for our creed, which means, of course, that most of these views are no longer held by most Christians today. The first was the notion that the Yahweh of the Jews was not the Father of Jesus, not the Father of Christianity or the Creator. They used this as a partial explanation for the existence of evil in the world. As we all know, I think, religion is an attempt by human beings to understand God and God's world. And therefore, it's always an imperfect understanding of what those issues are. And the Gnostics could not understand why evil persisted in the world, given a benevolent, all-powerful God. And so they created the notion that there were actually 2 gods. the God of the Jews, an imperfect God, a wrathful God, a nationalist God, the God of the chosen people, and then the God of Christianity, the Father, the first person of the Trinity, who was the perfect God of Christianity. That notion was rejected in Nicaea. The second idea that they proposed, and I think you can probably understand this, I, for one, find it extraordinarily difficult to understand practically what it means for us to say that Jesus was both God and man. What exactly does that mean for us and for him? The Gnostics answered that in a very interesting way. They basically said that Jesus was God, not man, and that everything he did on earth was play acting. It was like he was on the stage of the earth, going through life and preaching and teaching and ultimately dying, but not suffering on the cross because he was God. Once again, that notion was rejected in Nicaea. The third notion, a very critical one for the Gnostics, is that salvation is for very, very few. It's not for all people, and it's only for those who know the secrets that Jesus gave his disciples in the instances that are described in the Gospels, where Jesus goes off with his disciples to continue teaching them. Well, the Gnostics take that line and say, well, when he went off to teach them, he told them the real stuff, the real secrets of salvation, and they in turn imparted that to certain elites. And it's only by becoming part of this elite group and learning those secrets that you can be saved. Needless to say, that notion was rejected by Nicaea. And then the final notion that came out of the Gnostic era is one that, unfortunately, we still have very much with us. And unfortunately, it was not condemned specifically at Nicaea, and that is a profound Christian anti-Semitism. The Gnostics blame the Jews for the crucifixion and accuse the Jews of deicide. That notion was not specifically repudiated by Nicaea, and in fact, in a few minutes, I'll give you some examples of mainstream Christian theologians at the same period who were very decidedly anti-Semitic. By the time the Christian, what are now referred to as the fathers, well, when I was studying them, they were called the fathers of the church. Now we refer to them as the fathers and mothers of the church. These are the earliest educated elite Christians who came out mostly of the rabbinical schools, the cohorts of rabbinical scholars, and out of a few of the Hellenist big schools of the time. It would be improper to describe them as colleges or universities. Learned people at that time typically would attach themselves to someone they thought was learned, learn languages, rhetoric, and discuss ideas in a relatively small group of men. And these people began to write and began to add flesh to the notions of Christianity which are only hinted at in the Gospels. Originally, of course, the church was in Jerusalem, and most of the followers of Jesus remained in Jerusalem. The Acts of the Apostles tells us something about their life. I won't go into that in great detail today. except to state that they lived together in a ghetto, probably in what we would today call apartment houses, or condominiums came out of that period. Actually, the notion of a Roman condominium. The Christians lived together, they ate together, they cooked together, they raised their children and educated them together, and they shared their wages and took care of those who were in need. We would today, I think, describe that life as communism, pure communism. And that is essentially the first generation of Christianity after the time of Jesus. And in fact, there is a description in the Acts of the Apostles of a Christian who is asked to leave the group because he did not transfer all of his wealth to the group. And so we're pretty sure that that was the case. The group began to disperse because by the 60s, Jerusalem was becoming an almost impossible place to live. There were revolutions all around them. There were rumors that a massive army was coming out of the desert to unseat the Romans from the city. The Romans had shut down the city, shut all the gates, removed all the weapons they could find, and were essentially starving the city. And of course, in 68, the rebels did enter the city and they occupied the Second Temple. The Christians anticipated something like this the Christian Jews anticipated that something like this was going to happen and had begun to move. And church tradition tells us that Peter, one of the three leaders of the group, went to Rome, probably sometime around 63 to 65. In about the same period, John, the beloved disciple, left Jerusalem, presumably with Mary, to go to Ephesus. This is tradition. We don't have this in written history. And finally, we have the relatively certain notion that James, the older brother of Jesus, and the third pillar of the community, was hurled from the walls of Jerusalem as a martyr in 67. And so the three major leaders of the Christian community in Jerusalem were gone, and the community slowly began to move, and tradition tells us they moved to a city called Pella, which is currently in Jordan, on the east side of the Jordan River, up near the Sea of Galilee. Through time, there have been suggestions that we need to excavate the city of Pella to determine the presence of Christians there, but that has yet to be done. It is still one of the great unknown archaeological sites of the world that many people are quite anxious to get to. And so essentially, by the fall of the temple in 70, there were very few, if any, Christians left in Jerusalem. Antioch succeeded at that point as the capital of Christianity in the Eastern Roman world. Probably the largest community of Christians, very Jewish, very, very conservative. We get some notion of that in the letters of Paul and again in the Acts of the Apostles, talking about the life of Paul. And that there seems to have been quite a bit of division within the Antioch community as to the key early question of Christians, and that is, do you have to be a righteous Jew to be a good Christian? Paul, of course, answered that question no, and he was therefore thrown out of Antioch, essentially. And he went roaming around Turkey and the Balkans thereafter. Perhaps a wonderful event for the future of worldwide Christianity. Paul's communities tended to be relatively small and house churches. The church in Rome was relatively small. We know that by about 100, there were 3 house churches in Rome. One of them was headed by the then Bishop of Rome. And contrary to some revisionist history that has been proposed since then. He was not the chief bishop of the church, nor was he called the Pope. And by the time of the period I'm talking about, we're probably dealing with the third or fourth bishop of Rome. We have all of their names, incidentally, thankfully, because the Romans were great historians, and they gave us all the names of all of these people. But there is some indication from the Roman histories that this bishop wanted to build a basilica, and he didn't have the money to do so. He tried to unite all of the house churches in Rome under his leadership, and according to these histories, he was unsuccessful in doing so. So it was quite obvious that they had different ideas as to how Christianity should go on. And then finally, we had the Christian community in Alexandria, one of the largest, probably the second largest in the world. You know, many of us, when we think about Egypt and Israel, we immediately think about the Exodus, which occurred hundreds of years, centuries before the time of Christ. And we tend to think of Israel and Egypt as being very, very different places, probably at each other's throats since then. That is an incorrect notion. Israel throughout prehistory, by prehistory I mean before the time of Christ in this case, Israel was a very, very difficult society to live in. The climate change occurred quite often, and there were extended periods of drought, often 7 to 15 years. And being an agrarian society, a 10-year drought would starve you. Egypt, of course, was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, the most reliable source of food in the entire eastern Mediterranean, thanks to the Nile and their ability to continue to grow food every year despite the weather. And as a consequence, Jewish historians are now telling us that it was not unusual for small Jewish migrations to occur to Egypt on a regular basis. And that when the droughts ended in Israel, they would come home and then perhaps go back to Egypt. As a consequence, we now know that by 70, 80, 90, the second largest group of Jews in the world after Antioch were in Alexandria. And Alexandria, of course, became a place of great learning, one of the first great libraries of the world, which unfortunately burned. But there were large parts of Alexandria that became Jewish. And we now know that through that period, the Jewish people and the Jewish Christians in Alexandria both moved into trade and became instrumental in moving Egyptian food to Rome. And it's the origin of a great deal of the wealth of the early Christians and the Jews of that period. By Nicaea in the 4th century, there were essentially, the Christians accepted the fact that there were 5 centers of Christianity in the world. Jerusalem, which of course was a historical place, not a place which lived. Antioch, Rome, Alexandria, and just prior to the time of the Council of Nicaea, the Constantinople was established as the 5th. And these are referred to as the 5 patriarchies of early Christianity. And the power over early Christianity was shared among the patriarchs, or archbishops, if we would use that word today, of each of those 5 cities. Next week, I'll talk a little bit about Nicaea, but we will find that the patriarchs did not agree, and that the 2 principal patriarchs, the Patriarch of Alexandria and the Patriarch of Antioch, were at opposite ends of most critical issues by the time of Nicaea. And in fact, there were 6 councils after Nicaea, And the result of each one of those councils was determined by the number of bishops representing Alexandria or the number of bishops representing Antioch who appeared at the council. I'm sorry?
It sounds like the electoral
I'm not going there. So what were the ideas that were floating around at that period that we saw not decided yet? Okay. The first, of course, was the one I've mentioned many times now, and that is, how important was it to be a Jew, or at least to follow Jewish tradition, to be a good Christian? And there were two very, very different views as to that. The second was Eucharist. And in fact, this was an issue that was revisited as late as the Reformation and is still discussed among theologians today. And that is, what is the Eucharist? It seems that in most of Paul's churches and in Rome at the time, and probably Alexandria, communion or Eucharist was just that. It was a co-dining, a co-blessing of bread and wine, very symbolic, a sign of hospitality, a sign of community. While in Antioch, under the influence of the large Jewish community in Antioch, there was a greater emphasis on the high priest and on the sacrifice needed for the forgiveness of sin. And actually, we heard a section from the letter to the Hebrews this morning and in the liturgy, reflecting the notions that we think came out of Antioch right around 100, that Jesus was the high priest. And therefore, the Eucharist is a real sacrifice of a real body and blood. And the notion of transubstantiation started to be discussed as to whether or not the bread was really transformed, and if it was, how was it transformed and into what? So that issue was being discussed by 100 among these communities. A third and important issue was the question of baptism. Just what was baptism? Keep in mind that in the Jewish tradition, there was a cult of cleanliness and a requirement of ritual washing for various purposes. A woman had to be ritually washed before she came back into the community after her menstrual cycle. A scribe had to go through ritual washing before he participated in sacrifice in the temple, etc. And so there was a very developed notion of cleaning your body carefully in order to re-enter community and participate in the community's life. Of course, John the Baptist changed that. And we think that that notion probably came from the Essene community, which had divorced itself from Jerusalem about 50 or 60 years before the time of Jesus. We think John the Baptist was probably trained by the Essenes, and the Dead Sea Scrolls have shown us in some of the letters, some of the ritual documents that the Essenes wrote, that they practiced a ritual baptism as such. And for them, baptism was an initiation rite, that when you were baptized, you converted internally and became the member of the Essene sect through your baptism. Christians began then to discuss whether or not baptism was a one-time event or whether you could do it multiple times. Because it's quite obvious that, or it's at least obvious to me, that even though you can be converted on day 1, on day 10 you can sin. And you can, so those of you who have read the life of Constantine will remember that although Constantine became a Christian, he didn't do so until his deathbed. And the reason for that, of course, was that he believed that baptism was a one-time event and that if you sinned after baptism, you could not be saved. As a consequence of that, he waited until his deathbed to be baptized. That was developed quite a bit later by a man we know as St. Augustine, and that's really beyond the role of this. The role of women. It was very, very clear that the Semitic cultures in these ghettos, the Jewish cultures in these ghettos, made women subservient, very patriarchal societies. They, of course, clashed with the Hellenist notions, where women were treated not quite equal, but certainly with a great deal of responsibility, often with the ability to own property, engage in business, to go out in society without a protector male by their side. And so we have a Christianity which has these two very, very different notions of what the role of a woman can be in the church. And as we all know, that issue has continued for some 2,000 years. But it was started back then. The early leadership notions of the church began to be developed. They're sort of hinted at in the Acts of the Apostles. We had elders, whom the British word for elder is presbyter, and bishops, or episcopoi. And the episcopoi were the leaders of these Christian communities, elected by the members of the community and typically approved by the leaders of the surrounding communities. And they were assisted by priests or presbyters. There's pretty hard evidence today that, at least in the area around Turkey and in the Balkans, Greece and so forth, that many of the presbyters were women back in that time. And then there were deacons, and deacons were essentially responsible for the social welfare of the community. And again, both men and women shared that responsibility, except in the most conservative Jewish Christian communities. Then we had the beginnings of the notion of how a church should be established. We had the Pauline house churches, which were small, democratic, hosted by the owner of the home, typically. And by the middle of the 2nd century, some of the bishops or episcopoi were beginning to build basilicas, which was the name they gave to their first churches. They all had the exact same form. They all had the exact same geographic they faced east. I can't come up with the word right now. And then during that period, of course, the written Gospels began to appear. And until very recently, there was a general assumption that once a Gospel appeared, it never changed. We now have except of course by mistake, when it was translated or copied over in a scriptorium. We now have pretty hard evidence that, at least with respect to the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, by the end of the 1st century, there were multiple versions of both of those Gospels floating around the Christian world. And different communities used different versions. The most notable difference occurs in the description of the Eucharist in those Gospels. Curiously, however, and I made this point, I think, in the very first class, and that is, all of these versions are virtually identical when it comes to the Passion. So it was pretty clear that the community had professed a belief in the details of the crucifixion, which are very similar in all of the synoptic gospels, all 4 of the Gospels, actually, and the various versions of the Gospels that are now being found. We're finding, again, almost the identical description of the Passion. And then the final point, of course, as I just mentioned, was, who was Jesus? Was he a great prophet, the new Moses, the messenger of God, sent to the Jews to reform their religion? Or was he indeed the Son of God? We have some pretty good evidence from the early Judaic writings that were found in Babylon that until about 90, the Jews believed that Jesus might have been the Messiah. He was certainly a great prophet. But it was then that they began to recognize that when the Christians referred to Jesus as the Son of God, they meant literally the Son of God, not just a righteous man and great prophet. And we believe that toward the end of the first century, we begin to see a fairly profound split between Jews and Christians, principally over that issue and the monotheistic implications of that issue. I'm going to take a little bit of time now to talk a little bit about one of the very first individuals who wrote during this period and some of his ideas. Marcion of Sinope, and I really have learned a great deal about Marcion. Incidentally, my book about Marcion was published Thursday of this week, and it's available on Amazon, and it's called Heretic. This is the title. And the reason it's called Heretic was that in 144, he was officially declared to be a heretic by the Bishop of Rome, the first such declaration in the history of Christianity. We think that Marcion was born, we know, and as a consequence, we know quite a bit about him. Marcion was probably born around 80, and he lived to about 155. So he lived about 75 years. He was the son of the bishop of Sinope, the third bishop of Sinope. Sinope is a little town on a peninsula in northern Turkey which sticks out into the Black Sea, about 300 miles east of Istanbul. So it's well into the Black Sea. It was a seafaring town, and there were a lot of merchants there. He ultimately became a wealthy trader and shipbuilder, building a major shipyard which satisfied a great part of the trade in grain from Egypt to Rome. He became an extraordinarily wealthy man. We do know that he was slated to become the successor to his father as the Bishop of Sinope. But as a young man, he had, let's say, been indiscreet with one of the young female servants in his father's home, and essentially his father disowned him for that indiscretion. And so he was thrown out. And he joined up with his brother, and as I said, became a very wealthy shipbuilder. Sinope was one of the towns that was highly influenced by Paul's letters. Sinope, incidentally, is on the other side of the mountain from Galatia. And as a consequence, the letter to the Galatians had made wide circulation in this point. And the people of Sinope, along with those who lived along the Black Sea, would have been what we would refer to today as Pauline Christians. They were very, very much involved with the Apostle Paul's ideas. After a good deal of time, and he was also a very learned man. He studied with scholars from Alexandria and other places. Being a shipbuilder, he moved around the empire quite a lot. He became a scholar, and he concluded that it was time for the Christians to have a Bible. And so he obtained a very good copy, we're told, of the Gospel of Luke, which he rewrote. and he obtained 11 of the 13 letters of Paul, which he also rewrote. And he published that redacted version of those documents as the first Christian Bible in about 135. Had it copied many, many times, and that Bible became the Bible of what we know today is the Marcionite Church. It still exists in some sects, mostly in Syria and in Turkey today, although there are some strains of Coptic Christianity south of Egypt, which seem also to have adopted some of Marcion's ideas. And so, what did Marcion preach? Well, first of all, he was accused of being a Gnostic, which was a no-no at that time. It turns out he probably was not, although many of his ideas paralleled theirs. He certainly accepted the idea that there were two gods. He even named the God. He renamed the God of the Jews, Yahweh. He named him the Demiurge, or half-god, or semi-god. And then there was the God the Father. And he explained evil using that notion. He too was very much an anti-Semite. When I said he rewrote the Gospel of Luke, of course we know from even today, reading the Gospel, that Luke's Gospel is the most Hellenist of the four Gospels. It's the one that was aimed at people who were not initially Jews, most likely, and that it was written for the Greeks. Many people today believe, for example, that Luke was a companion of Paul for many years, and as a consequence, Luke's gospel reflects many of the ideas that are also reflected in Paul's letters. But Marcion took that to the next step, well beyond the notion of Paul. And you will remember that I mentioned last week that one of the issues that Paul preached over and over again was that you did not have to be a Jew to be a Christian. Well, of course, Marcion adopted that notion, and he took it the next step and began to accuse the Jews of deicide, of killing Jesus. And so he was probably the first anti-Semite of note in the early Christian church. Marcion took his gospel, his Bible, to Rome. And I mentioned to you a few minutes ago that the Bishop of Rome was at that time trying to raise money to build a basilica in Rome. And he had been unsuccessful in doing so. And Marcion arrived on the scene, realized what the story was, and went to the bishop's community and made a very, very large contribution to build the church. It is described by Tertullian as being the wages of 4,000 workers for 1 year. And that's been translated in various ways, and it's described as being a gift of, in today's terms, probably something in excess of $1 billion to build this church. At the next meeting of the council of the church, Marcion appeared. He presented his Bible, and he described it, and then preached its major terms to the presbyters who had been gathered together by the Bishop of Rome. They were horrified. The Bishop of Rome immediately adjourned the meeting and indicated that everyone needed time to read the documents and study them, and they would meet again in a short period of time. They met again. We're not sure exactly how quickly. It might have been 2 weeks, it might have been a month, I just don't know. But by then, the Bishop of Rome and his Jewish allies had rallied the troops, and in the second meeting, Marcion was roundly condemned and declared a heretic in 144, told to leave the church and go into repentance. He disappeared. We have nothing further about him. We know his churches survived into the 21st century, but it does not appear that he was a major figure in moving those churches forward. I find it very, very curious, however. I've come to really enjoy this guy, and I think I know who he is. We don't have any of Marcion's writings other than the Bible. The other writings did not survive. And everything we know about Marcion was given to us by his biggest enemy about 100 years later, about 50 years later, a man by the name of Tertullian, whose name you may have heard before, another father of the church, so to speak. And fortunately, from our standpoint, Tertullian quoted much of Marcion's materials in toto in his condemnations of what Marcion had done. As a consequence, we really don't know too much about the end of the life of Marcion, but I find it extraordinarily curious that the next 3 or 4 people who the church points to as being the fathers of the early church, and I may have time to talk about some of those next week, but I've given you some brief outlines in the materials I've handed you. Virtually all of those people adopted Marcion's notions, and by the middle of the 2nd century, the Christian church had become intensely anti-Semitic, and a great deal of the persecutions that we read about today were not Roman persecutions of Christians. They were Christian and Jewish persecutions of each other, and occasionally, when the Romans came on the scene to make peace, they would capture the leaders of both groups and bring them both to justice, so to speak, in the Colosseum. And as a consequence, a lot of the persecution language that we see in the early 2nd and 3rd century Christian church is not accurate. Some of you were at a talk last spring where we were basically brought through the modern history of the modern understanding of early Christian persecution. I don't have time to go into all of the details of that today, but I think it's important for us to recognize that by the time that the Christians were talking about persecution, they were really being persecuted by the Jews. And the Jews, in turn, were persecuting the Christians because they were living together in ghettos. And as you know, the easiest person to take your revenge upon is your nearest neighbor, particularly when the force above you is overwhelming and armed. Okay, I will take about 2 or 3 minutes of questions, and then we have to clear out for the next service. I will spend a little bit of time talking about some of the other ideas that came out of the early fathers. I've briefly described them in the materials that I've given you. I clearly do not, in this 5 weeks that I've had, the opportunity to take you through all of them in detail. I will try to hit some of the ideas that came from each of them rather than describing them in the level of detail that I've described Marcion. But I can take a question or two right now before we break.
I have a question.
Yes.
You talked about the Marcion Bible, but what about the NIV, the New King James Version? How did those other...
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
You talked about the Marcion Bible, because you just wrote the book, but what about the other versions of the Bible, the NIV, the New King James Version?
All right.
How did those
There, I'm going to give you a 1-minute history of the Bible, okay? The Jewish Bible came into existence when the Septuagint was published, probably about 50 years before the time of Christ. It was published in Greek, and it translated the original books of the Hebrew Bible into Greek and added the the wisdom literature. In the 4th century, St. Augustine was asked to make a proposal as to what the Bible should look like. He did not feel he was qualified to do so, and so he convened an ecumenical council in Alexandria. And a number of bishops at that time made a proposal as to what the Bible should look like in Greek, and they established the Bible in Greek. That Bible was subsequently translated by St. Jerome into Latin, and then at the time of the Protestant Reformation, when it was translated into many different languages, all the other versions of the Bible that we now have came into existence. But they are all based on the Greek Bible that was adopted at the time of Augustine, as translated by Jerome 200 years later. And then there were hundreds more years before it became translated into other languages, and even today we see the Bible translated into different languages, but they're essentially different translations of the same Bible.
Thank you.
I can talk to you afterwards. I know they need to get ready for the next liturgy. I will be outside in the courtyard if you want to talk about that more. I will also have the suggested reading.
David has to do AV training.